Olá, pessoal! Estamos só começando. Hoje a gente vai começar falando de... Na verdade, desculpa, pessoal. Vamos lá. Quando pensamos em um ambiente plural, diverso e que promove oportunidades para todas as pessoas, um aspecto que não pode ficar de fora é a humanização. Como é que a gente não pode falar de humanização aqui, né, pessoal? Neste mundo volátil, complexo, incerto e ambíguo, no qual a tecnologia e a inovação transformam os cenários em um intervalo cada vez menor, a nossa liderança não pode ser pautada por uma narrativa da era industrial. Humanização das empresas e trazer reflexões que fazem a diferença, eu convido para estar conosco Sudhanshu Palsule, pensador e líder nas áreas de liderança em complexidade transformativa. Palsule é também educador e autor premiado, atuando globalmente como consultor de liderança para equipes de alta administração e CEOs.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and I hope you can see me. I'm just delighted to be here today with all of you for this very important meeting. And thank you for that great introduction. I'm sorry, I wish I was there in person because I would have loved to be part of the gathering, but thanks to technology, I'm able to do this from a very, very long distance. My topic, which I'm going to talk about today, is about rehumanization. And as you just heard, the world has come to a place where I think we do need to ask questions about what it means to be human, what it means to rehumanize ourselves again, and what it means to rehumanize our leadership going forwards. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to share some pictures with you because I would love to have some slides at the back, because at least that way you don't have to look at my face all the time and you have some nicer pictures to look at. So let me see if I can just very quickly do that and then we'll get started. Okay, so I'm not able to do that from my end, but if you can play it from your end, the slides, that'll be great. So one of the things I want to talk about right away is this topic of rehumanization, is how important it is that we need to understand that the world is a lot more complex than what it ever used to be in the past, right? And that's one of the things we'll have to look at, which is there's been a long, long narrative of dehumanization. In fact, one of the jokes that I have is, 4 years ago, I sat down to write a book called Rehumanizing Leadership. And I still remember that morning when I sat down at my computer and I typed in the word rehumanizing, and instantly my search engine auto-corrected it to dehumanizing. And it just shows how so much more of our concern is about dehumanizing leadership and not rehumanizing. There's been a long, long narrative of dehumanization in the world where it's almost become normal to talk about, to understand that it's okay to be not human, right? We also have a few other myths that have carried on for so many, many decades. Another example is the myth of self-maximization. By that, I mean that we've come to believe that we are selfish as human beings and that we're all here to look after our own interests. And this may not be entirely true, and it's certainly not scientific at all, but at some point, it started becoming validated as a scientific fact. It's not a scientific fact. The fact of the matter is that evolution is not just about competition, but it's equally about collaboration. And human beings, in a way, have evolved over the tens of thousands of years, the hundreds of thousands of years, through collaborative means and what my previous speaker called the sorority, more than just by competition. Competition is one very small part of it. It's much more through collaboration and working together. And that's another myth that's been around for a long time. And the third myth, which I think has been around for a long time, is that men are just more dominant and therefore women have to be subservient. And again, there are so many narratives around this where you look at evolution and that's never been the case, right? It's not always been the case. And yet one of the myths that has come out of it is precisely that, the whole idea of men being more dominant and women becoming more subservient. Now, there is a social reality to this, but it's not a biological reality, and it certainly is not an evolutionary reality. So we've got to understand that we are now at a very crucial time in our history as a species. Forget about men and women. We are at a crucial stage as a species, as Homo sapiens. Already we are starting to see the incredibly disastrous impact of environmental degradation in the world. We are starting to see a whole lot of divisive politics all over the world. We are starting to think about what are the impacts going to be of digital technology and social media on polarizing the world even further. And that's why when I wrote the book on rehumanizing leadership, it was meant to be at this very, very timely, important time in our history. But before I start talking about what it means to rehumanize, I want to talk a little bit about what I call the three great separations that have happened in our past, as a result of which we are in the situation today. So I call them the three great separations, right? And the first separation was really in terms of, as it applies to human beings, the separation from nature, right? Where we just at some point broke away from our connection with nature and we assumed ourselves to be a lot more important, a lot more developed. And nature became something that had to be dominated, to be controlled, to be made fallow. And the entire industrial revolution that took place was built on the assumption that human beings had to control and tame nature. And it's a very interesting fact that when you look at the early references to nature that were made in the 17th and 18th centuries, and even in the 19th centuries, they usually associated nature with the feminine, right? So in the English language, for example, the kind of adjectives that we use to describe nature, which is tempestuous, unpredictable, violent, volatile, and these are the same words that were used by writers to describe women. Now, by creating a connection between women and nature, what happened is that the domination of nature was eventually the domination of women. And this is a very interesting thesis that was created by a woman called Ryan Eisler way back in the early 80s when she wrote a book called The Chalice and the Blade, in which she made a very compelling argument for how by equating women and nature, men managed to become dominant on both. So the first big separation that we had was a separation from nature. The second separation I want to talk about, which is historical, is the separation from ourselves, from our deepest selves. And this is where, in a way, Western civilization took the lead, and now the rest of the world has just followed, where we started breaking up, the human being into the thinking part and the body part. And famous philosophers like René Descartes started in France. He talked about re cogitans and re extensa, which literally means the part that is the thinking part, and the rest of it is just an extension, which is the body. And as a result of this, we lost our connection with feeling. And to me, this is one of the most important separations that have happened in our species, our loss of connection with our feeling, with our true self, where we truly live. Because feelings were seen as unpredictable and emotions were seen as something to be controlled. And once again, the historical connection was made between emotions as something that women carried and men were much more rational. So that's a second example of how we have normalized this domination over women historically, by equating women with emotions. In the previous example, I talked about equating women with nature, and now I'm talking about women and emotions. And once again, the domination was possible. The assumption made here at that time was, of course, that men are more rational and women are more emotional. And the whole thing is scientifically ridiculous. There is no such thing like that, right? In fact, men suffer probably more because they have disconnected themselves from their feelings, even more. But this was another big separation, right? Where we created a normalcy around it, right? It's only today that now modern medicine is finally beginning to talk about the reconnection between the mind and the body, that the emotions influence the body. Whereas traditional wisdom all over the world knew about this a long time ago, but we went down a long, long path of that separation about 300-400 years. And now we are at a stage where we'll have to reclaim ourselves again. So to me, rehumanizing also means going back in touch with who you are as a person. And that means truly healing ourselves. And the last separation I want to talk about is the separation from value, right? So we started putting a price on everything, but we lost the value of everything. And this is really an important example because if you take a look at nature, for example, from a GDP perspective, the only time nature becomes valuable in the economic system is when it's cut down, right? So a forest becomes valuable to the GDP, to the economics of a country when you cut it down, when you convert that into wood and resources. And it's only now that we are starting to understand how illogical and stupid this argument is, right? It's such an illogical argument where we don't see the intrinsic value of things. And in the same way, we don't see the intrinsic value that's prevalent in the human species. So, jobs that involve caring or educating or healing or even concerning by looking after people have traditionally always been undervalued, right? You could be an investment banker and earn a lot more, but if you are a hospital nurse, you earn less, right? And this, by the way, during the pandemic, I think all over the world, we became aware of this discrepancy between between value and who we are. So these are the three great separations that have kind of paved the way for our civilization. And then it ends with leadership, right? If you take a look at leadership and traditional definitions of leadership, it's all about the Superman who is able to come down and rescue organizations and societies. And I've been teaching leadership now for the past, 30 years. And every now and then, when I pick up a book or when I look at something on leadership or when I'm invited to a conference on leadership, 9 out of 10 examples about leadership are all about men, right? It's almost as if we don't have women leaders. We don't have stories about women leaders. And this to me is criminal and it's got to end. And that's why when I wrote this book on rehumanizing leadership, it was also with that in mind, that to truly become human means we've got to embrace both aspects of who we are, male and female. And because that's the way we are. But unfortunately, our whole understanding of leadership, especially when it comes from the industrial age, is all about that male hero who leads from the front, right? And our stories and our examples of leadership are about the individual who comes down and does something amazing. And now here's an interesting fact. The 21st century is now so complex as a world, as global societies, that it's virtually impossible for any one person to be a leader, right? So leadership by default is already starting to become distributed. And when you take the example of, when we look at the way women lead, it's entirely different from the way men lead. There's been a lot of incredible studies done on this, right? So great women leaders build communities. The previous speaker talked about the example of Ubuntu, right, which is a fabulous concept that comes from ancient African culture. And it literally means I am because you are. Without you, there is no me, right? So that understanding has to come into the way we lead. And the 21st century, in a way, has got to have that, because if we don't bring that back into our way of thinking, we are finished. The global human problems have become so complex that no one individual, no one organization, no one society, no one political leader can sort them out. We have no option but to collaborate. We have no option but to build global communities. And women do that a lot better than men do. So again, when it comes to leadership, we have to think about this. I think we are at a time in our history where we are facing a real crisis of meaning. We are facing a real crisis. We need a new story. The old story is no longer working, right? And I think the pandemic, in the way it has impacted on all of us in the world, is a reminder of how fragile our species is, and how if we don't change the way we operate, the way we work, the way we relate to each other, the way we manage, the way we govern, it's looking extremely precarious, right? So we are truly facing a crisis of meaning. We are at a huge watershed moment in our history right now. And that's why this particular Congress that you have brought together is a very, very important forum to start talking about what's the future going to look like? What should it look like? And it cannot be what it's been until now. That narrative has got to end, right? I was thinking of one of your great philosophers, Paulo Freire, who once said, a structure that does not permit dialogue has got to be replaced, has got to be changed. We have structures today in which there is no dialogue, there is no community, there is no sorority, there is no sense of bringing people together. We have a fragmenting philosophy, right? Our ideology is all about fragmentation and division and polarization. We cannot go on like this. And this is a perfect opportunity for us to talk about this. Now, if you take a look at, what human beings really want all over the world, it doesn't matter which culture you come from, which society you come from, but all over the world, if you look at what human beings really want, the four basic human needs, they're very simple. One is to know, right? We need to know. It's a fundamental human need to know, but it's not just knowing information, but to know the context. There's a real hunger for context that human beings have. And context means we need to know why we are here, right? Why we do what we do, why I'm engaged in something. So that's one of my first needs, the need to know. The second one is the need to grow, right? All human beings, wherever we come from, have a fundamental need to grow. And grow means to make progress, to move forwards, to achieve personal mastery, as we call it in psychology, because that gives us a sense of dignity and self-worth, which is fundamentally important to all human beings, right? The third need is to connect. It's a powerful human need that is wired into us from an evolutionary perspective. There's a need to connect. And that means we want to feel we belong. We want to feel we are part of something bigger than us, right? A community, a sense of connection, a sense of relationship. And the last one is to be valued, right? And value comes when we get meaning from what we do, when we derive meaning from what we do. So it's not just important to have a job which pays a salary and then you can drive a car and you can have a house and a family. If that work doesn't provide meaning, that work becomes worthless, right? At some point. So when I talk about these four needs, know, grow, connect, value, leadership has got to provide for that, especially in a complex 21st century where we are starting to see, for example, the millennials, the younger people, starting to make some choices based upon these four needs, right? And what the pandemic has done in the last year and a half is that it has helped people to reevaluate their life choices. I'm coaching a lot of senior executives right now who are saying to me, I really don't know whether I should continue with my corporate career for the rest of my life. They say, well, I'm 45 years old, and I'm just wondering whether I should make some new choices. And when I ask them what is behind it, they say, my work is dehumanizing me, right? I want to do something which is more human. And this is a fascinating time to talk about. And also, with the advent of digital technology and more digitalization happening in the world, we've got to create human spaces. And that's where women's leadership truly becomes an important contributor. So, what does it mean to humanize or rehumanize, right? And to me, it's a very simple thing. To rehumanize means you've got to make the conscious effort to dignify your relationships with the people that you lead, right? And with the larger ecosystem in which you operate. You got to dignify that relationship. And in the I don't know how the word translates into Portuguese, for example, but in the English language, it's a very old-fashioned word, right? To dignify, dignity. And it's the opposite of what we call devalue, right? Many of our organizations end up devaluing people, unfortunately, with the structures that we have, with the hierarchies, with the way we work, with the way we take away the dignity of our people. We end up devaluing our people. And here's an opportunity for us in the 21st century to create workplaces in which we truly dignify our relationships, right? Now, a lot of people say, dignify, does that mean you're always nice and kind? Oh, absolutely not. For me, the difference is if you can provide some very firm feedback to somebody else, but you can do so without taking away their dignity. And that to me is the most important thing. So to me, rehumanizing means you dignify your relationships with the people that you lead and with the larger ecosystem in which you operate. One of the biggest challenges, or the biggest challenge that is going to face all our organizations from here onwards, is not about how successful you are or how competitive you are and how innovative you are. Those are different things. The biggest challenge is how relevant are you going to be in the ecosystem, in the larger ecosystem? How relevant are you going to be? So the question of relevance is so important that we've got to pay attention to it. And to me, when you talk about rehumanizing your leadership, you're building relevance into your system. That's how you stay relevant. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about I've got 10 minutes more, so I'm just going to share something over here. When I was doing some research for this book I wrote last year called Rehumanizing Leadership, I interviewed lots and lots of neurologists and cognitive psychologists all over the world, right? Because I was asking them one fundamental question, which is, what is that thing that AI can never replicate, right? Artificial intelligence and machine learning and all those wonderful things that we've got now. What is that human quality or the human behavior or a human emotion or something in a human being that no AI can ever replicate? And interestingly, I got a couple of great answers. The first one that I got was a sense of purpose. Sense of purpose. That however sophisticated your AI can be, it's never, ever going to have purpose. Purpose is that uniquely human ability that we carry with us, right? Where we want to have meaning in what we do. We want to have meaningful relationships, meaningful work, a meaningful organization. We are constantly searching for meaning, and what purpose does is provides that meaning. Now, I don't know if we live in a purposeful universe. I hope we do, but I don't know. As a scientist, I have no evidence that we live in a purposeful universe. It might be completely random. I don't know. But the one thing that I do know is that as human beings, we require purpose in our lives. We require meaning in our lives. So purpose is that one answer that I got from the neurologist who said AI can never replicate that. And you know what the second answer was? Something closely connected to purpose, a sense of empathy, right? No AI, however sophisticated, can be empathetic. AI can be intuitive, but not empathic. And when I heard those two things, I thought that's really what to be human is all about. Empathy, of course, can lead to other things like compassion, curiosity, and all those wonderful things. But at the most basic level, it's about purpose and empathy. And we began calling these two things the two vectors of evolution. The vectors of evolution. It's almost like evolution that led to us as Homo sapiens decided to have those two as our fundamental building blocks of our nature, of our behaviors. And I think it's time to recognize those all over again, because especially empathy, for the last so many decades, or maybe even centuries, we've kind of banished it from the world of leadership, from the world of doing business, or even from any kind of human interaction. And I think it's time to bring that back. So there's, if you do pick up that book and read it, you'll find that there's a lot of science behind empathy. But here's one thing I'd like to share with you. When it comes to empathy, women completely they outpace men by miles. In fact, women develop the empathic function much earlier than men do, and they retain it and develop it all through their lives in much more ways than the way men can. Women are naturally a lot more empathetic than men are, but also in the way they conduct themselves in the social constructs, they use their empathy a lot more. They're not afraid to do it. They're not afraid to be empathetic, because empathy and acting upon empathy requires courage. And that's what women do. And if the world required one thing today more than anything else, it's these powerful levels of empathy that we need to have for each other. In a world that is fragmenting and polarizing so quickly, we need to bring that back into ourselves, into our organizations. And can you imagine what power this function has that we carry inside our brains, right? The ability to see the world through another person's perspective. Be that person, be that from another culture, another society, another gender, another orientation, another background, but to be able to see the world through that person's perspective and to recognize that it's an important perspective. When I talked about dignifying relationships, which is at the heart of rehumanizing the world and rehumanizing our leadership, it automatically includes. So today we've got a whole lot of work going on inclusion and diversity, which is great. But long before we started talking about inclusion and diversity, women have always known what it means to include. We've always known that as women. Unfortunately, we built organizations after the Industrial Revolution that were about exclusion, right? If you take a look at a typical 20th century organization, it is built on the philosophy of exclusion, not on inclusion. So we've got to work 10 times harder today to build inclusion into our workplaces, right? That's the struggle. And it's really a funny situation, isn't it? Because if you take a look at the way we've evolved as a species and the whole force of life itself, it's about inclusion. It's about bringing together. It's not been about fragmenting. That's in the recent past, right? So when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about diversity, that sense of empathy that you require to make it happen has always been there. And women leaders have always known about it. It's now time to bring it back. So for me, the two things just come together: purpose and empathy. Purpose talks about why we exist, and empathy talks about this is how we care. So why we exist and this is how we care come together, and they create an extraordinary combination where people start feeling included, where we start dignifying our relationships. We dignify our relationship with the ecosystem. We build on more sustainable goals for the organization. And that's the world we need to leave behind as a legacy for the future generations. There is so much strife going on right now. It's heartbreaking when you talk to the young millennials all over the world who are starting to, you know, reconcile to the fact that the world is a hard place, environmentally, politically, organizationally. And we've got to do something about this because for the future generations, we've got to leave behind a better world, a more humane world, a human world in which purpose and empathy play a rightful role. And I want to end by saying I'm so optimistic about the fact that women leaders are the ones who can take this forward. And that's why this particular Congress that you've organized and the theme that you've chosen for this year's conference is so timely. And it's been my privilege to be part of this. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I my contribution is extremely tiny compared to the great work that so many others have done. But I just wanted to, come and send one message to all of you, which is that if there is going to be a rehumanizing in the world, a rehumanizing in the leadership that we want, it's going to be the women leaders who are going to take that forward. And I wish you all the very best in everything you do from here onwards. Thank you very much for having me here.
Mas obrigada, Palsule. Que aula, gente. Quantos aprendizados tivemos hoje. E mais do que isso, olha o que o IVG está nos proporcionando. Simplesmente conexão com a Índia, desbravando fronteiras. Quanto aprendizado. E o melhor, gente, a gente está apenas começando. Teremos ainda muitos conteúdos relevantes em nossa programação. Mas por falar em relevância, chegou a hora de fazermos as nossas primeiras conexões com um painel imperdível sobre tecnologia e inovação. Vamos conhecer, logo após a nossa vinheta, as grandes referências com quem vamos aprender. Super mulheres, garanto.